What if the weak old man you're about to ignore is the reason you're free to stand here in a white coat at all? The question hung in the air when he stepped through the sliding doors, quiet, slightly hunched, one hand pressed to his ribs as if every breath had a price. He didn't complain. He didn't demand. He just moved with the calm of someone who has learned that panic wastes oxygen. To the staff, he looked like a familiar problem. Another elderly patient, another non-urgent case, another person who would take time and give nothing back. He approached the front desk with a polite nod and slid a small card forward with trembling fingers. "I'm sorry to bother you," he said softly. "I think something's wrong with my chest." The receptionist barely looked up. "Take a seat. We'll call you," she replied, already turning to the next person. He sat. Minutes stretched. Pain sharpened. His breathing got shallower, but his posture stayed controlled, as if discipline could steady his heartbeat. When a nurse finally called him, she didn't say, "Sir." She said, "Grandpa," like he was a child who'd wandered into the wrong building. In triage, he answered every question without drama. No exaggeration, no pleading. He even apologized again, as if suffering was an inconvenience. That was their first mistake, confusing restraint for weakness. The nurse glanced at the monitor, sighed, and wrote like she was documenting an annoyance. "Probably indigestion," she muttered, loud enough for him to hear. "Older men come in for gas all the time." He didn't argue. He simply asked, "Could it be serious?" She shrugged. "Let the doctor decide." Then she rolled him into a corridor where the fluorescent lights made everyone look pale and disposable. When the doctor arrived, he didn't introduce himself. He stared at the chart, not the man. "You're 78, he said. "Any history of anxiety?" The old man's jaw tightened, then relaxed. "No, doctor. I know what anxiety feels like. This isn't that." That sentence should have slowed the room down. Instead, it sped it up. The doctor chuckled, spoke to the nurse over him, and waved a hand like the case was already solved. And while they dismissed him, the old man's fingers slipped inside his jacket, not to cause trouble, but to steady a small metal tag hanging on a chain, his thumb brushing the engraving like a ritual. Before this story goes any further, pause for a second, because moments like this are exactly where understanding makes all the difference. If you're still watching, it means you already feel that quiet anger building, that sense that something deeply wrong is happening right in front of you. And that reaction matters. Stories like this aren't just about shock or drama, they're about recognizing injustice when it wears a polite face and learning how easily real honor can be overlooked. Take a moment to share your thoughts in the comments. Tell me what went through your mind when they dismissed him so casually. Did it remind you of someone you know, or a moment when respect was denied too quickly? Reading and understanding different perspectives here strengthens the message more than you might think. If this story is pulling you in, make sure to leave a like. It helps this message reach people who believe respect should never depend on appearances. And if you haven't subscribed yet, consider doing it now so you don't miss what happens next. Because what's about to be uncovered changes everything in that hospital hallway. They left him there longer than protocol allowed, long enough for the pain to stop being sharp and start becoming frighteningly dull. Anyone who has lived long enough knows that silence in the body can be more dangerous than screaming pain, but the staff didn't read bodies. They read stereotypes. To them, he was just another elderly man occupying space, another delay in a system that prized speed over dignity. A different nurse passed by and glanced at him, then at the clock. "He's still here?" she asked, not quietly. "Didn't we already check him?" The old man lifted his head slightly. "Ma'am," he said, calm but strained, "the pain is getting worse." She exhaled through her nose, irritated. "Sir, you need to be patient. This isn't a hotel." Then she walked away before he could answer. That was humiliation number one, being spoken about as if he wasn't there. When the doctor returned, he did so with a resident in tow, using the old man as a teaching prop. See, he said, tapping the chart. Classic case of age-related discomfort. Happens all the time. They feel something unusual and assume the worst. The old man met his eyes. Doctor, I've felt unusual before. This is different. The doctor smirked. You've lived a long life. Bodies break down. That's reality. That was humiliation number 2. Having lived experience dismissed as ignorance. They ordered basic tests but delayed anything urgent. No cardiac consult, no escalation. He was wheeled past younger patients who arrived after him and were seen immediately. Each time it happened, his grip tightened on the armrest, not from jealousy, but from an old instinct he couldn't turn off, the instinct that told him when a chain of command was failing. At one point, an intern joked near the nurses' station. If we admitted every old guy with chest pain, we'd need a second hospital. Laughter followed. Soft, careless, cruel. The old man heard it all. And still, he said nothing. Silence had once kept men alive. Silence had once meant discipline, not weakness. But in this place, silence made him invisible. Then came the moment that crossed the line. A nurse adjusted his IV too roughly, and when he winced, she rolled her eyes. Sir, you're not in combat. Relax. The words landed heavier than the pain. For a split second, something flickered behind his calm expression. Memory, restraint, a lifetime of control snapping tight again. He opened his mouth, then closed it. Instead, his hand drifted back to the chain beneath his shirt, fingers brushing cold metal, grounding himself. What none of them realized was that every dismissal, every joke, every careless word was stacking up like evidence. And somewhere in the hospital system, buried under layers of bureaucracy, a record existed that told a very different story about who this man really was. The room hadn't changed yet. The tone hadn't shifted. But the injustice had reached a point where someone would have to intervene. By the time they finally moved him into a curtained bay, his skin had that gray, waxy tint that doesn't belong to indigestion. He wasn't dramatic about it. He didn't clutch his chest and beg for help. He simply sat very still, because he'd learned long ago that wasted movement steals strength. But his breathing kept catching, tiny pauses that made the air around him feel thin. A monitor beeped with a rhythm that was just off, not loud enough to trigger panic, not obvious enough to force action. The kind of subtle warning that only matters if someone actually cares to look. A nurse glanced at the screen and frowned for half a second. Then she smoothed her face back into indifference. It's fine, she said, more to convince herself than anyone else. He's stable. The old man's eyes stayed on her. Ma'am, he said quietly, I don't think I am. She adjusted the blanket like that solved it. Try to relax. Stress makes it worse. Then she stepped out, already talking to someone about a lunch break. Minutes later, the doctor returned and made the worst kind of decision. The kind that feels efficient until it ruins lives. We'll discharge him once labs come back, he said to the resident. No need to tie up a bed. The resident hesitated. But his pain? He's 78, the doctor cut in. Chest discomfort happens. We can't treat every sensation like a crisis. The old man swallowed, slow and controlled. Doctor, he said, please just run the full workup. The doctor didn't even look at him this time. You've waited this long, you can wait a little longer. And then it happened. A sharp dip on the monitor, a stutter in his rhythm that made his vision blur at the edges. His fingers tightened on the mattress. He didn't shout. He didn't flail. He lifted one hand, palm up, like a signal, a silent request for immediate attention. A different nurse pulled the curtain back, annoyed. What now? His voice was thinner than before. I feel dizzy. She rolled her eyes and checked the IV line as if the problem had to be his fault. Your blood pressure's probably low because you haven't eaten. He tried to sit up, and for the first time his composure cracked. not into panic, into something colder. He gripped the bed rail like he was bracing on a moving vehicle. His breathing shortened, each inhale shallow and incomplete. Then the resident noticed something. Not the obvious part. The obvious part was being ignored, like everything else. It was the tiny detail. The old man's hand slipped under his shirt, and his thumb pressed against something hanging on a chain, almost like a coded habit, almost like a ritual before impact. "What is that?" the resident asked, half to himself. The doctor scoffed. "Probably a lucky charm." But the resident leaned closer and saw the edge of metal, a stamped number, the corner of an insignia he recognized from a textbook and never expected to see on a patient in a civilian. Hospital. The old man's eyes met his, steady, exhausted, but still commanding in a way that didn't match the frail body in the bed. "Please," the old man whispered, "don't let them send me out." The resident's throat tightened. He looked back at the chart, then at the chain again. The chain wasn't the real problem. The real problem was that someone had already decided this man didn't matter. And that's when the resident made a choice that broke the hospital's lazy rhythm. He stepped out, went straight to the system terminal, and typed the old man's full name exactly as it appeared on the worn card, adding the strange number he'd glimpsed on the metal tag. The screen loaded, then froze, then refreshed with a file header that didn't belong in any hospital database. The resident's face drained of color. The cursor blinked on the screen as if even the system needed a second to decide whether it should show what it was about to reveal. The resident leaned closer, rereading the name. The number, the classification code that had just surfaced. This wasn't a normal medical cross-reference. This wasn't insurance or veteran benefits or anything that belonged in civilian healthcare software. This file carried layers, restricted layers. He scrolled carefully. Each line felt heavier than the last. Service branch, clearance level, years of active duty that didn't align with ordinary enlistment, commendations listed without detail, as if the details themselves were dangerous. And then, the phrase that made his stomach tighten: direct command liaison, do not disclose. The resident swallowed. He glanced down the hallway toward the curtained bay where the old man lay, quiet, still being treated like a burden. The contrast was unreal. The system was telling one story. The hospital was living another. A senior nurse walked past. "Did you find something?" she asked casually. He minimized the screen on instinct. I think there's been a mistake." She laughed. "With him?" Doubt. But curiosity got the better of her. She leaned in as he reopened the file, and her smile faded almost instantly. "What is that?" she whispered. "I don't know," he said honestly, "but it's not supposed to be here." They scrolled further. Dates jumped decades. Operations were referenced but never named. Entire sections were blacked out, not deleted, intentionally sealed. At the bottom was a single instruction line that changed everything. "In case of medical emergency, notify command. Immediately." Command. The nurse straightened like someone had snapped a string attached to her spine. "This has to be old," she said, though her voice lacked conviction. "He's just an old man." The resident shook his head slowly. "Old files don't update themselves." He pointed to the timestamp. "This was accessed less than a year ago." The room felt smaller. Suddenly, the jokes from earlier echoed differently. The word grandpa sounded uglier in retrospect. The resident felt a wave of cold realization. This man hadn't introduced himself, hadn't corrected them, hadn't used his past as leverage. He had let them misjudge him. "Should we tell the attending?" the nurse asked. The resident hesitated. "If we do, it won't stay quiet." As if summoned by the tension, the system emitted a soft alert. Not a medical one. A communications prompt. An automated message had already been sent, triggered by the access itself. External line engaged. Await response. The nurse's eyes widened. Who did it contact? Before the resident could answer, the phone on the wall rang. Not the front desk phone, not a ward extension, a red line handset that hadn't been used in years. Down the hall, the old man lay still, eyes closed now, breath shallow but controlled. He had no idea the room was changing. Or maybe he did. Maybe that calm wasn't resignation at all. Maybe it was certainty. Because somewhere beyond the hospital walls, someone had just been notified that one of their own had been dismissed, endangered and nearly sent home to die, and people like that don't ignore calls. The response came faster than anyone expected. The red line phone stopped ringing on the second tone, as if the call had never truly been waiting. The resident picked it up with a hand that suddenly felt too light. He didn't speak first. He didn't need to. "Yes," he said after a pause, his posture unconsciously straightening. "He's here, in the East Wing." The nurse watched his face change as he listened. The casual slouch she'd seen all night vanished. His eyes sharpened. He answered questions in short, precise sentences, repeating information directly from the file, careful not to improvise. When the call ended, he set the receiver down gently, like it mattered. "They're sending someone," he said. The nurse's voice came out thin. "Who?" He shook his head. "They didn't say." Word traveled fast after that, not through announcements, but through behavior. A cardiologist was suddenly paged, urgently. The attending physician was called back from another floor. A supervisor appeared, her tone clipped, her smile gone. Orders that had been brushed aside minutes earlier were now repeated with intensity, as if the room itself had shifted hierarchy. In the curtained bay, the old man opened his eyes as footsteps multiplied around him. He didn't look surprised. If anything, there was a quiet acceptance in his gaze, like he'd known exactly how long it would take. A nurse leaned over him, suddenly careful. "Sir, we're going to run a few more tests." He met her eyes. "Thank you," he said without irony. As equipment was wheeled in, someone finally noticed the metal tag resting against his chest where his shirt had slipped open. Not a lucky charm, not jewelry. An identification tag, old, worn, engraved with a serial number and an insignia that hadn't been issued in decades. The attending doctor froze when he saw it. "Where did you get that?" he asked too sharply. The old man's voice was steady. "It was given to me." The doctor opened his mouth to press further, then stopped when the supervisor shot him a warning look. The file had reached her too. She didn't know everything, but she knew enough to understand that the rules had changed. Then the automatic doors at the end of the hallway slid open with a sound that cut through the room like a blade. 2 uniformed officers stepped inside, their presence immediate, undeniable. They didn't rush. They didn't look around in confusion. They walked straight toward the bay where the old man lay, their eyes scanning the room with practiced efficiency. Conversations died mid-sentence. Monitors seemed louder. The air felt heavier. One of the officers stopped at the foot of the bed and spoke with calm authority. "Sir," he said, nodding respectfully, "we've been informed there's been a situation." The old man looked up at him, and for the first time since entering the hospital, his expression changed, not into anger, into recognition. "Yes," he said quietly, "there has." Behind them, the doctors and nurses stood frozen, watching the scene reassemble itself into something they no longer controlled. The file hadn't just changed a diagnosis, it had redefined who mattered in the room. And whatever came next, it wouldn't be handled casually. The hallway seemed to narrow as more uniforms appeared, not loud, not dramatic, but precise. Movements were economical, voices were low, every step carried intention. A senior officer entered last, his posture unmistakable even without insignia drawing attention to it. He paused just inside the bay, assessed the situation in a single sweep, then removed his cap. "Sir," he said, addressing the old man directly, "I apologize for the delay." The words landed like a shockwave. Apology was not something this hospital had offered him, not once. The officer didn't raise his voice, didn't demand explanations, yet the entire staff felt the correction instantly. Spines straightened. Hands stopped fidgeting. Even the monitors seemed to fade into the background. The attending doctor stepped forward, trying to regain authority. "There's been a misunderstanding." The officer raised a single finger, not aggressively, decisively. "There has been a failure," he said. "We'll discuss responsibility later." Silence followed, the kind that presses on your ears. He turned back to the old man. "Your service record was flagged the moment your file was accessed. You should, never have been left unattended." The old man exhaled slowly. "I didn't want special treatment." The officer nodded once. "You deserved competent treatment." That distinction mattered. Orders followed, not shouted, not debated. A full cardiac team was mobilized. The discharge note was shredded without ceremony. Tests were escalated. Procedures that had been unnecessary minutes ago were now mandatory. No one questioned it. No one dared. A nurse who had mocked him earlier stood frozen near the wall, color draining from her face as she realized the weight of every careless word she'd spoken. The doctor avoided eye contact, suddenly very aware that hierarchy wasn't defined by titles on a badge, but by accountability. As the team worked, the officer leaned closer to the old man. "You held your composure," he said quietly, "as always." The old man gave a faint smile. "Old habits." Outside the bay, staff whispered. Not jokes anymore, not impatience. Fear mixed with shame. They were witnessing something rare, true authority correcting a civilian system that had failed its most basic duty. And as the old man was prepared for immediate intervention, the room understood something irreversible had happened. Respect had been restored, but the reckoning wasn't finished, because when honor walks into a place that has forgotten it, silence is only the beginning. No one spoke as the procedure preparations continued. The silence wasn't calm. It was heavy, charged with everything that had been said earlier and could never be taken back. The same doctors and nurses who had dismissed him now moved with exaggerated care, afraid that a single wrong gesture might expose them further. Their confidence was gone. In its place sat an uncomfortable awareness. They had judged, and they had been wrong. The old man was transferred to a higher-level unit, not rushed, but escorted, with respect. As they moved him down the hallway, conversation stopped. Staff stepped aside instinctively, eyes following him, not with curiosity now, but with something closer to reverence. The transformation was complete. Nothing about his body had changed, yet everything about how he was seen had. The attending doctor stood near the wall, arms stiff at his sides. He watched the officers walk beside the gurney and swallowed hard. The realization hit him late, but hard. Authority doesn't announce itself. It reveals itself only when tested, and he had failed that test. As they passed the nurse's station, the officer stopped briefly and turned, not to lecture, not to threaten, but to state a fact. "This man served with distinction," he said evenly. "He did not ask for recognition. He asked for care." No one replied. There was nothing left to defend. The old man caught the eye of the nurse who had called him Grandpa. She looked away first, shame burning across her face. He didn't glare, he didn't smile. He simply looked tired, tired of being underestimated, tired of watching values erode where they mattered most. Inside the room, as the doors closed, the officer leaned in one last time. "You'll be taken care of now," he said. The old man nodded. "I know." Outside, the hospital returned to motion, but something fundamental had shifted. The laughter was gone. The shortcuts felt riskier. The memory of that metal tag, that quiet voice, that sudden reversal lingered like a warning, because everyone in that hallway had learned the same lesson. Too late for their pride, but not too late for the truth. Never underestimate someone by what you see. If you stayed until this moment, it means this story spoke to something deeper than entertainment. It means you understand that respect, honor, and dignity aren't earned by appearances, but by character and sacrifice. And stories like this only matter if they're shared with people who still believe that truth. If this message resonated with you, subscribe to the channel now. This space is for those who value justice, who recognize real authority, and who refuse to judge a person by what's visible on the surface. Before you go, leave a comment saying, "Respect is earned in silence." That lets me know you truly understood the lesson behind this story. And don't forget to hit the like button, especially if you believe veterans should never have to prove who they are to deserve basic human dignity. Finally, watch the next video appearing on your screen. It tells another story where appearances lie, the system fails again, and hidden honor forces the truth into the open.